Right. I remember when I was a kid, my parents would always be playing like the Beatles and the Beach Boys and Elvis and Roy Orbison, stuff like that. And then also I remember they would leave the radio on like in my room when I was asleep at night, so I had like pop music implanted in my head at a young age, I think. When I was in high school, I started getting into music, and there was a band locally called The Peeps, and I went to Sunburst Records, and I picked this record up for $2.25 back in the day, probably 1994 or something like that.
It was during one of those get-to-know-you conversations, like when we first started hanging out, that I found out his dream was to own a record store. This was the very first record I bought. Radiohead's Amnesiac. I would buy records from bands that I liked even without owning a record player, and then eventually when we hung out, his record player was broken, so that was the best first birthday present a girlfriend could do. So I did that, and then we got to listen to all of our old records together. Aww.
So we were selling stuff out of our closet on eBay for a couple years, and then it was like taking over a whole bedroom, and we were just kind of like, we need to start looking for a place. And then around that same time we found out about Low Mill, so kind of ended up starting to sell stuff at the artist market here and eventually getting our own space.
We started off in a pretty small location. It was about 200 square feet, but at that point, that's like all we needed. We had just enough inventory to fill that, and it was really cute.
Our initial stock came from buying some records from a friend that was selling his collection. So we bought a few hundred from him and started with that, and then once we had a location, we started buying stuff from our customers, and it sort of accumulated pretty fast just because there was no one else in Huntsville at the time buying records.
We weren't in that space for too terribly long before we jumped over to our, we had like double the space. And then that's when we introduced like a record wall. But then quickly, as we bought more and more collections from people, our space grew. And it was almost like clockwork. Like we'd find a really, really awesome deal on like 2,000 records, and we just couldn't pass it up. And then we were like squeezed in the space for a while, and then a new space would open up. So it's kind of been like that every time.
So we moved 5 times up on the second floor, and then we moved out here outside into the railroad room about 2 years ago.
One of the reasons we started the store was so local musicians could get their feet off the ground. So it's really great when local artists stuff do sell, and people come in specifically to ask for that.
I think ever since probably 2005, there's been sort of a resurgence in vinyl. People like just being able to go to a store and be able to buy music from an actual person instead of just on their computer, and get good artwork and good sound quality.
I mean, we always see people who have never crossed paths before, and then they strike up a conversation, and it happened actually between 2 guys, and now they like play music together. So it's just always interesting. You can't get that from buying music online.